Many millennia ago, there existed on Earth a highly advanced civilization. Its inhabitants possessed knowledge and technologies that surpassed not only their contemporaries in other parts of the planet, but possibly even people of the 21st century. Remnants of this civilization are found on different continents, structures, drawings, records, and legends. It is believed that mighty Atlantis was buried by a natural disaster, and since then, no one has been able to find it. The story of Atlantis is far more complex than people usually think. What initially seemed like a myth, a legend, an entertaining mystery from the past, is in fact one of the most important global phenomena. It influenced the rise of Hitler, forced many to look differently at our past, and the long-awaited discovery of Atlantis could not only solve a centuries-old riddle, but also completely change the commonly accepted knowledge about human civilization. Okay, in a sense, this is a new format on the channel, a historical travel video. To unravel the mystery of Atlantis, we will visit most of the planet's continents: South America, Antarctica, Africa, and Eurasia, potential places where the sunken civilization could have been located or might still be located. The history of Atlantis stretches from ancient Greece and Egypt, passes through the Renaissance, Nazi Germany, and reaches our days. Today, you will see a huge number of verified historical facts, conspiracy theories, and just top-tier nonsense. In short, a large-scale narrative. And so that an excessive amount of information doesn't confuse inexperienced seekers, first we need to focus. The key figure in this story is Plato, a famous philosopher whose name is known even to someone for whom philosophy is limited to pseudo-intellectual quotes from VK Contacte public pages. The reason why everyone has heard of this bearded man is simple. He is the most influential person in the history of Western philosophical thought, or at least one of a few, as any professor in the field would confirm. But I'm not going to overload you with the history of philosophy. Well, maybe just a little, and later. For now, it's important to understand this. Plato is not some bearded guy in a tinfoil hat overheating under the warm Greek sun 2,500 years ago. Plato is a respected historical figure. Why does that matter? The widespread view is that the story of Atlantis is just a myth, and in general you could agree with that, end the video and go home. But Plato, a highly respected ancient Greek philosopher acknowledged by the academic community, did two things that transformed the Atlantis story from implausible into quite possible. First, Plato repeatedly claimed in his writings that Atlantis truly existed and that he knew about it from reliable sources, none of which was an NTV channel. Second, the philosopher described what Atlantis looked like and how it functioned. And I'm not talking about some rough visualization. I'm talking about urban planning and political structure, agriculture and crafts, flora and fauna, mineral resources and trade, the number of warships and soldiers, detailed descriptions of buildings, their colors, materials, and even exact numbers for their height and area. Have you ever read a fairy tale where it carefully specifies how many meters tall one building is, how many meters tall another is, and what the area of fertile fields is? Of course not, unless you consider everything that makes you sleepy a fairy tale. In that case, a 7th grade geometry textbook is fairy tale number 1. Thanks to animation and cinema, everyone has a typical image of Atlantis in their head. Superhumans, advanced technologies, energy crystals, and so on. Hard to believe, but in some ways what Plato described is no less astonishing. So, it's time to turn to the primary sources, Timaeus and Critias.
These are Plato's works that hardly anyone without a PhD in philosophy would have read if Atlantis had not been described there. Timaeus and Critias are written as dialogues. Several real historical figures who lived a few centuries before our era are speaking. Plato knew most of them personally. Through the character Critias, who is believed to be Plato speaking, this is what he tells about an ancient, highly developed civilization and its fate, briefly. First of all, we care about two questions: time and place. In other words, when did Atlantis exist and where? It happened 9,000 years ago, says Plato's character. And here it's important to understand he is counting from his own time, which is several centuries before our era. That means that in the case of Atlantis, we are talking about roughly 9,500 BCE. This is an important time marker, and it will come up again and again. According to Plato, Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules. This definition most likely referred to the elevations on both sides of the Strait of Gibraltar, the place that separates the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean. The text also mentions a war between those who lived inside the pillars and those beyond them, apparently between the Greeks and the inhabitants of Atlantis. So, the lost civilization was once located in the Atlantic Ocean. I understand the hypothesis that Atlantis was located in the Atlantic Ocean sounds like Captain Obvious, but only until you learn that, according to Plato, the inhabitants themselves probably did not call their homeland Atlantis. The place had a completely different name. So, we've clarified where and when. Now, the most interesting question remains: what was the legendary Atlantis like? If you type this into Google, many results will look similar. Several rings of water and land around a large plain, all of it on a huge island the size, quote from Plato, larger than Asia and Libya. The central area with those rings was a bustling port. All channels were connected so ships could pass through. In the very center stood a majestic temple of Poseidon, luxuriously decorated, including golden statues. According to Plato, Atlantis was the richest state that had ever existed. Mineral resources, agriculture, and advanced achievements, like a sophisticated irrigation system that allowed harvests twice a year. Atlantis was protected by a large army and navy, and, as I said, Plato gives numbers for all of this: palace height 200 meters, canal width 100, number of ships 10,000, and so on. Plato also gives a clear answer as to what happened. After a chain of unprecedented earthquakes and floods, Atlantis disappeared in one day and one night.
So, in principle, the story is straightforward. But here's the problem. In more than 2,000 years after Plato's death, no one has been able to find Atlantis. Enthusiasts who claim they've discovered the real location point to completely different places on the planet. In the story of the lost civilization, there is a lot that is unknown, but one thing is obvious. All locations cannot be winners in this mysterious lottery. There can be only one winner, if the lottery existed at all. Yes, you can assume Plato simply invented it. But first, there are other interesting facts and evidence. And second, Plato is an authoritative figure. So today we will examine most of the theories about Atlantis, and, spoiler, we will get fairly close to the solution. Atlantis is not the only lost city or civilization. The reason it won't let people go is not Plato himself. He is just a strong argument in favor of its existence. The real reason is that it might have been a civilization with advanced technologies and knowledge, not only for its time, but possibly even compared to ours. And here we immediately step onto thin ice, full of conspiracy theories. However, understanding that the Atlantis topic contains many unknowns, I decided from the start I will not dismiss hypotheses just because they sound crazy. Here's why. In the history of science, there are many examples where theories were first rejected as insane and later became the foundation of scientific understanding. You've probably heard of the concept of plate tectonics. Continents constantly move, and once they were a single supercontinent called Pangaea. The theory was proposed by the German scientist Alfred Wegener about 100 years ago. For half a century, it was described with adjectives from crazy to unfounded, and today it's a fundamental concept in earth sciences and part of school geography. You've probably never heard of Wegener, but he was a real scientist, and sometimes his theories can be used. He probably didn't think his theory would one day become an excuse to watch an NTV documentary, but that's exactly what I did. Sorry, Alfred. I'll repeat, it doesn't matter how crazy a hypothesis about Atlantis sounds. What matters is whether it has arguments and what those arguments are. The first point worth analyzing is technology. More precisely, the incredible technologies of Atlantis, which humanity either reached only recently or hasn't reached at all. If you look at how Atlantis is often portrayed in cinema, it's usually futuristic. Among Atlanteans who are obsessed with the mystery, there's a version that the inhabitants were capable of space travel and advanced planning, used powerful lasers, in short, lived a fully technological life. Remember, we're talking about a period more than 10,000 years ago. Okay, we're open to new ideas. So let's look at the arguments and also clarify, how can we determine whether a city-state or civilization existed thousands of years ago and what was happening there? In archaeology, there is a concept called a cultural layer, and it doesn't mean a narrow group of ancient people who went to the theater and listened to opera while their contemporaries drank wine under a tree with chanson music. A cultural layer is literally a layer. If you look at soil in cross-section, it consists of layers that correspond to different time periods of human habitation. The deeper, the older. A layer can contain all kinds of evidence: bones, tools, technologies, remains of buildings, jewelry, traces of traditions and rituals, and so on. In addition, drawings, hieroglyphs, texts, and even oral sources, like legends, can be used.
Using all these finds, scientists can decipher text, compare artifacts between regions, run DNA tests, or conduct radiocarbon analysis. Radiocarbon dating is an actual super technology I learned while making this video. By measuring the amount of carbon in remains, you can determine age, because the older something is, the less carbon remains. From all this, it becomes clear. There are many ways to prove super technology among the inhabitants of Atlantis. And the most interesting thing is that supporters of this theory do have an argument, though basically only one: the so-called Abydos hieroglyphs. They were found in an ancient Egyptian temple and are believed to date to around the 1200s BCE. There you can see something resembling a submarine, an airship, and the main star of the image, a helicopter. Where would the ancient Egyptians get knowledge of such technologies? Nothing like that has ever been found in Egyptian excavations. According to Atlanteans, what happened is the Egyptians learned about these inventions from the few surviving inhabitants of Atlantis. And this isn't the only link. One of Plato's sources was supposedly an Egyptian priest. But honestly, does the carving truly depict a helicopter, or do we see a helicopter because the human brain tends to recognize familiar symbols in unfamiliar shapes, like clouds that look like animals, although it's just a shapeless cluster of droplets? According to Egyptologists, the situation was different. The temple was built and decorated for one pharaoh, but he died, and work continued under another. So one hieroglyph was carved over another, and over time, erosion did its work. Two separate inscriptions blended visually, creating shapes that look like modern machines. Archaeologists also found no evidence that Egyptians possessed such technologies or even knowledge of them. So science concludes the super technology argument is not convincing. And it's also worth noting, when people talk about Atlantis' super technology, it's always about spaceships, lasers, submarines, but nobody talks about, say, bulldozers. And you can't dig the water channels described by Plato with a spaceship. However, if we're talking about super technology relative to that era, the question is harder. Advanced construction, seafaring, irrigation systems, around 9,500 BCE sounds impressive. And now it's time to talk about NTV documentaries, at least the few I watched about Atlantis.
However, if we're talking about super technology relative to that era, the question is harder. Advanced construction, seafaring, irrigation systems, around 9,500 BCE sounds impressive. And now it's time to talk about NTV documentaries, at least the few I watched about Atlantis. If you want, you can find them on YouTube yourself. Yes, it feels like the scriptwriter, editor, and the rest of the team basically worked for food because the documentaries are mostly edited from random stock footage rather than filmed specifically for the movie. Yes, in one of the docs, the main expert on Atlantis is for some reason not an archaeologist, not a geologist, but a philologist. I don't know, maybe the authors thought that all words ending in logist mean roughly the same thing. But the films are built on many real facts. Often those facts are pulled out of context and mixed into a pretty strange stew. Still, there's one important idea in those documentaries that's genuinely interesting and worth discussing. That thousands of years ago, when people on the planet were supposedly nothing more than primitive hunter-gatherers, there existed a very developed civilization for its time. And many later achievements of ancient peoples, like the Egyptians with their pyramids, were created thanks to secrets and technologies inherited from that very civilization, which for some reason disappeared. And of course, the main candidate for that civilization is Atlantis. The idea that behind the achievements of ancient civilizations stood an even older and far more developed culture is not new. In the 20th century, plenty of people around the world held to similar views. In anthropology, there's even a concept for this, diffusionism. In short, it's the idea that the technological and cultural development of peoples happened through borrowing, mixing, and conquest, that is, the direct opposite of evolutionism. If we reduce diffusionism to a simple example, Egyptians and other civilizations built impressive pyramids one after another, not because they independently figured it out, but because they borrowed technologies from a more ancient and developed people. And since we're open to new ideas in this video, let's examine this theory more closely. Oddly enough, it will bring us closer to the Atlantis mystery. NTV films are funny, but because they're so cheaply made, you don't really believe them even before checking the facts. A very different feeling appears when you watch Western analogs. One of the latest projects widely discussed online is Ancient Apocalypse, a Netflix documentary series with a huge budget, filming around the world and plenty of beautiful drone shots. The main idea is, long ago, right after the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 BCE, there existed a highly developed human civilization that completely disappeared, most likely due to some natural catastrophe. Important clarification. I understand that for many people, any time BCE just means very long ago. But there's a big difference between 10,000 BCE and 4,000 BCE. Around 4000 BCE, people in ancient Egypt figured out how to plow land with a plow, and the famous pyramids appeared about 1,500 years later. Around 10,000 BCE, according to classical science, most of Earth's population were hunter-gatherers, supposedly incapable of building any pyramids. But the authors of Ancient Apocalypse claim that around 10,000 BCE, there existed an advanced civilization for its time. And there's lots of evidence for it, yet mainstream science ignores these arguments and even tries to silence opponents.
The Netflix series features several real archaeologists, Joe Rogan, the host of arguably the most famous podcast on the planet, and the whole team is led by journalist Graham Hancock, a guy who for decades has been writing bestsellers about a vanished advanced civilization. So let's look at their arguments. Most of them can be reduced to one word: patterns, repeating elements found in ancient cultures that supposedly developed independently. The first and most obvious element is pyramids in different parts of the world. People built very similar structures thousands or hundreds of years BCE. The Pyramid of Khufu in Egypt, Choga Zanbil in Iran, Caral or similar Andean sites in Peru, Meroe in Sudan, and so on. Coincidence? Of course not, supporters of alternative history say. Why would people in different cultures build similar religious structures? Because they reproduced knowledge from an ancient advanced civilization, or were taught by representatives of that civilization. And under that ancient advanced civilization, they usually mean Atlantis. If you don't go into details, like most viewers of such documentaries, the argument looks logical. But let's dig deeper. Are all those examples pyramids? Absolutely. Does that mean they were all built with the help of Atlantis or higher powers? Absolutely not. They are similar in shape, and that's exactly why we call each of them a pyramid. But putting an equal sign between them is like identifying houses all over the world as the same thing just because they have windows, doors, and a roof. If you want to build a stable structure reaching upward, a pyramid is the most logical solution. That's it. And the examples differ enormously in construction techniques and purpose. Some have terraces, some don't. Some have flat tops, some are pointed. In some cultures, they were tombs. In others, places for ceremonies. The idea that Egyptians couldn't build their pyramids themselves is so popular as a conspiracy theory that it has been analyzed 1,000,000 times. Any historian specializing in ancient Egypt will tell you where the material came from, how it was delivered to the site, and how the structure was built. How do scholars know this? Roll the video back. Cultural layers, tools, texts, comparative analysis, everything we listed earlier. Another interesting pattern across cultures is the Great Flood story. A legend about a terrifying global flood exists among many peoples and religions around the world. What does this have to do with Atlantis? According to alternative historians, directly. That's supposedly how Atlantis went under. One of the most famous concepts here belongs to a scholar named Velikovsky. In the mid-20th century, he proposed the following theory. Around 1500 BCE, a piece broke off of Jupiter and began traveling through the solar system. Passing near Earth, it supposedly stopped Earth's rotation, causing an unprecedented tsunami, flood, and earthquakes. After that, the piece of Jupiter flew further and eventually became what we now call Venus. Meanwhile, huge territories sank underwater, including Atlantis. Humanity then suffered mass amnesia because of how dramatic the event was, so no concrete mentions or traces of Atlantis remained, except a few legends. The theory sounds ambitious. I'm not a physicist, so let's consult an expert, Carl Sagan. He examined what's wrong with Velikovsky's theory. In short, Velikovsky never explains how a piece could break off from Jupiter. But even more importantly, Jupiter and Venus have different chemical compositions. A comet passing near Earth couldn't stop its rotation, and if it did, there's no chance Earth could return to normal rotation afterward. There is also no geological evidence for a global flood or worldwide earthquakes around 1500 BCE. And finally, Velikovsky was not an astronomer or physicist. He was notably a psychiatrist and a student of Sigmund Freud. Attentive viewers will also notice Velikovsky's Atlantis date doesn't match Plato's, by not just a few years or centuries, but by 8,000 plus years.
Still, alternative historians have a plan B: rapid sea level rise.
The theory. Around 10,000 BCE, the last ice age ended. The ice melted, sea levels rose, and Atlantis was flooded. Only a few survived and reached Egypt, from which the information eventually came to Plato. The dates roughly match Plato's works. Some even name a specific location, Bimini Island, near the southeastern coast of the United States and the Bahamas. This is beyond Gibraltar, and Plato never specified how far beyond. Underwater, there is the so-called Bimini Road, a stone formation with a fairly regular shape that some believe was built by Atlantis. As an additional argument, they cite the Piri Reis map. A Turkish navigator drew it in the early 16th century. For centuries it was considered lost. Then part of it was found, showing the coastline of South America and supposedly Antarctica. In the upper left there is an island, possibly Bimini, and in the middle of that island you can supposedly see the Bimini Road when it wasn't yet flooded. The authenticity of the Piri Reis map itself is not disputed by scholars, meaning it's not a fake. So let's look closer at this theory. Even without fact-checking, a question appears. Why would you draw an ordinary road on a map? Surely a highly developed civilization would have larger and more interesting objects, like a big temple or something. If we dig into the map's details, we also learn Piri Reis compiled it using dozens of older maps, and his work contains many inaccuracies and quirks. For example, north is positioned differently in different parts of the map. So the island with the road is likely rotated, and it's not Bimini at all, but one of the Caribbean islands, Puerto Rico, while the road in its center is simply a mountain chain. Now, about the road itself. Yes, it resembles a road. Unfortunately, resemblance is the only argument. According to geologists, the theory. Around 10,000 BCE, the last ice age ended. The ice melted, sea levels rose, and Atlantis was flooded. Only a few survived and reached Egypt, from which the information eventually came to Plato. The dates roughly match Plato's works. Some even name a specific location, Bimini Island, near the southeastern coast of the United States and the Bahamas. This is beyond Gibraltar, and Plato never specified how far beyond. Underwater, there is the so-called Bimini Road, a stone formation with a fairly regular shape that some believe was built by Atlantis. As an additional argument, they cite the Piri Reis map. A Turkish navigator drew it in the early 16th century. For centuries it was considered lost. Then part of it was found, showing the coastline of South America and supposedly Antarctica. In the upper left there is an island, possibly Bimini, and in the middle of that island you can supposedly see the Bimini Road when it wasn't yet flooded. The authenticity of the Piri Reis map itself is not disputed by scholars, meaning it's not a fake. So let's look closer at this theory. Even without fact-checking, a question appears. Why would you draw an ordinary road on a map? Surely a highly developed civilization would have larger and more interesting objects, like a big temple or something. If we dig into the map's details, we also learn Piri Reis compiled it using dozens of older maps, and his work contains many inaccuracies and quirks. For example, north is positioned differently in different parts of the map. So the island with the road is likely rotated, and it's not Bimini at all, but one of the Caribbean islands, Puerto Rico, while the road in its center is simply a mountain chain. Now, about the road itself. Yes, it resembles a road. Unfortunately, resemblance is the only argument. According to geologists, the Bimini Road is a natural stone formation that often appears in tropical coastal zones. Over time, it cracks, producing something that looks like separate slabs. Analyses dated to around 3,000 years old, nowhere near 10,000 BCE. And finally, our favorite question. Even if it were Atlantis's road, why is there not a single other sign of a highly developed civilization around it? A funny fact, the original author of the Bimini Atlantis idea was a man who considered himself a clairvoyant. Now let's return to the core. Could Atlantis have sunk because of post-Ice Age sea level rise? Maybe not near the Bahamas, but elsewhere in the Atlantic or Mediterranean. Science says sea level did rise after the Ice Age, but we're talking millimeters or tens of millimeters per year. First, that's not enough to drown a giant island bigger than Asia and Libya. Second, the flooding of coastal areas happened gradually. If a highly developed civilization lived there, over decades they would notice what was happening and relocate to safer areas, leaving behind, logically, material traces. And since I mentioned the Piri Reis map, I must say what it's most famous for. Many claim it shows Antarctica's coastline without ice, but Antarctica was officially discovered only in the 19th century, while the map is from the 16th. And if Antarctica once was ice-free, then Atlantis could be there. The most amazing thing is, Antarctica really was ice-free over 30 million years ago. Therefore, first, what people take for Antarctica on the map is likely just an extension of South America, given the inaccuracies already discussed. Second, even if Atlantis existed, it clearly was not in Antarctica. So we've examined many alternative ideas about Atlantis. If you thought that was all, look at the video timeline. It's not so terrible when bold but baseless theories become the foundation of entertainment documentaries. But it's a very different matter when such ideas are used to unleash the most horrifying war in human history and carry out mass extermination. Yes, I'm talking About Hitler.
While preparing this video, I thought the only link between Hitler's Germany and the secrets of lost civilizations was Indiana Jones movies. But reality is far more interesting. Perhaps no people in history wanted to find Atlantis more than the Nazis. The lost civilization was, in a way, part of their strategy for victory in World War II, and in the end, one of the reasons for their defeat. So, how did Hitler and his associates become obsessed with Atlantis? A core ideological component of Nazi Germany was the concept of their supposed superiority over others. To prove this, in the mid-1930s, they created a special organization called Ahnenerbe, led by one of the key figures of the Third Reich, Heinrich Himmler. In simplified terms, the idea was Germans are descendants of a forgotten Aryan civilization that originated in Atlantis. After Atlantis was flooded, survivors scattered across the world, which is why similar cultural elements and writing appear in different regions. Eventually, due to continuing sea level rise, in search of higher ground, representatives of Atlantis ended up in Tibet. These people were supposedly the ancestors of the superior Aryan race that, according to the Nazis, later became them, including Germany. Huge funds were spent on research, expeditions, and excavations, especially in Tibet. Spoiler, they found nothing because it was completely anti-scientific nonsense. But that didn't prevent them from starting a bloody war and killing many people.
partly because in Nazi ideology others polluted the world. Pay attention to the dates. Plato wrote about Atlantis around 360 BCE. Nazi searches were in the 1930s, 1940s CE. What happened to the Atlantis story in the 2,000-plus years between? Spoiler, almost nothing. After Plato's death, Atlantis basically interested no one. After Europeans discovered America and found civilizations like the Maya, some ideas appeared that these were heirs of Atlantis, but nothing moved beyond hypotheses. That continued until the second half of the 19th century, when Heinrich Schliemann, German entrepreneur, Russian subject, and amateur archaeologist, excavated Troy, the legendary city from Homer's epics. Later, it turned out everything was more complicated. Maybe it was Troy, maybe not exactly, but the point is this. In the 19th century, a near unshakable belief emerged that amazing cities and lands described by ancient authors could be real geographical places. Around the same time in the United States, politician Ignatius Donnelly wrote the book Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Atlantis, the world before the flood. Donnelly largely repeated Plato's thesis about an advanced civilization, though he removed divine elements like Poseidon. Donnelly suggested Atlantis perished in the Great Flood and was located in the Atlantic Ocean. As arguments, he pushed diffusionism again, pyramids on different continents, flood myths, and so on. Donnelly's work can be called the second most important text in the history of the Atlantis myth after Plato. So, the two main sources about Atlantis are Plato and Donnelly. Donnelly's book was officially recognized as pseudo-scientific, and it's clear why, since many of his weak arguments we've already discussed. Also, what he writes about Atlantis mostly repeats Plato anyway. Since we've spent enough time critically analyzing alternative historians, let's also treat Plato carefully. Was he simply writing nonsense? Plato created the works mentioning Atlantis around 360 BCE. Did he ever see Atlantis? Of course not.
That character Critias, who tells the story, was a real person and Plato's relative. According to Critias, he heard the Atlantis story from his grandfather, who heard it from Solon, an Athenian statesman. Solon never saw Atlantis either. He allegedly learned the story during a trip to Egypt, where a local priest told him about a mighty island in the Atlantic Ocean and all the details of Atlantis' structure and fate that Plato later recorded. Meaning, even before digging into details, the source chain is weak. Written records began only about a century after Solon. Before that, it was oral transmission. So all those precise details, numbers of ships, heights of buildings, depths of canals, were supposedly memorized and retold. Solon likely didn't know Egyptian either, so communicating with the priest wasn't easy. By the way, Atlantis was a name Critias supposedly invented while translating from Egyptian. So if Atlantis existed, its inhabitants called it something else. Okay, suppose Solon understood everything perfectly, memorized it, and passed it on correctly. Where is the guarantee the Egyptian priest told a real story? According to him, it happened 9,000 years earlier, roughly 9,500 BCE, when mammoths still walked the earth. Also, Plato's story contains a strong divine component. Atlantis was created by Poseidon, who divided the state into 10 districts for his sons. In general, once you consider these facts, it becomes tempting to conclude Atlantis is simply a myth invented by Plato. But not everything is that simple. Two questions remain. Why would Plato invent it? Most importantly, what was he basing it on? Even the most fantastic stories in literature usually have some realistic prototype, meaning Atlantis might have existed in some form, and Plato either saw something like it or learned it from sources that were not so distant. Let's answer in order. First, the reason. Here, as promised, we need a brief dive into philosophy. Plato was a master storyteller. In his philosophical works, he often inserted fantastic plots to illustrate ideas. His most famous work, The Republic, is dedicated to the concept of an ideal state, and even there you can find stories like a dead warrior's experience and reincarnation. So in academia, a common view is Atlantis in Timaeus and Critias is a moral tale about what happens to a state,
even a developed one, when its rulers and society become prisoners of power, greed, and arrogance. Aristotle, another famous philosopher, agreed with the idea that Atlantis was unrealistic. Not only did he know Plato personally, he was his student for many years. Still, it seems less plausible that Plato invented the Atlantis legend out of thin air. It may be like a based-on-true events movie. The plot is heavily changed, but something at least vaguely similar happened. That would mean some kind of prototype of Atlantis existed. Now we will discuss 3 of the closest candidates. Our big journey begins on the Greek island of Thera, better known as Santorini. It's famous for beautiful views and is popular with newlyweds worldwide. But we care about something else. From high altitude, the island's shape looks familiar, doesn't it? If you recall typical Atlantis pictures based on Plato, and then imagine how Atlantis would look if it were partially flooded, you get Santorini, more precisely the Santorini archipelago. Now, since resemblance is the best friend of conspiracy theorists, let's look for additional evidence. On the map, we see Santorini is in the Aegean Sea, near Greece and Athens where Plato lived, and in the Mediterranean region. This place didn't always look like this huge donut. It became that after a catastrophic volcanic eruption around the 1600s BCE. Santorini is perhaps the only Atlantis candidate that has support even among some skeptical scholars. For example, Jacques Cousteau made a documentary there about searching for Atlantis. The biggest hint is the lost city of Akrotiri. In the mid-century, there was only a small fishing village there, but archaeologists discovered the remains of a large, thriving port city. People of the Minoan civilization lived there. Around 1600 BCE, a powerful volcanic eruption occurred, and the city was buried under layers of ash. Scientists found many destroyed buildings, pottery fragments, tools, animal bones, and more. But they found no human remains, suggesting the inhabitants had time to leave before the ash buried everything. Near Santorini is the famous island of Crete, the center of the Minoan culture. You probably remember the legend of the Minotaur locked in a labyrinth. Minoan buildings used white, red, and black stone, and in the end, the Minoan civilization disappeared roughly 1,000 years before Plato.
I'm reminding you of this because these are small clues pointing to where Plato might have gotten the idea for Atlantis. In his description, there are mentions of buildings made from red, white, and black stone, the image of the bull, and of course, a natural catastrophe that destroyed a flourishing place. Plato could have known about Akrotiri and the fate of the Minoans. Yes, many of his details don't match history, dates and location especially, but we already agreed it might be a story based on real events. Now to another interesting candidate, not far from Santorini, Malta. Malta is an ancient island whose history you probably know little about. And yet, the oldest structures in Europe are there, thousands of years older than the Egyptian pyramids. Even more surprising, the people who built these ancient structures on Malta mysteriously disappeared around 2500 BCE, and the island was resettled much later. Was a natural catastrophe the cause? Unknown. One of Malta's biggest mysteries is the strange cart ruts, tracks carved into the rock dating to several thousand years BCE. Some run between structures, others begin from nowhere and abruptly end. The point is, no one really knows what they are. There are versions that these are tracks from wheeled vehicles of an ancient advanced civilization at a time when the very concept of the wheel supposedly wasn't known to people. Another version, these are water supply or irrigation systems like the ones Plato described. So, perhaps Malta was Atlantis. After all, it's an island. Yes, the ruts are carved into limestone, a relatively soft material, but their exact purpose remains unclear, which fuels interest among alternative history fans. Add to this the ancient megalithic structures and the disappearance of the population, and Malta becomes one of the candidates, though it matches Plato much less than Santorini. We move on. Next stop, Spain, the city of Cadiz. Plato wrote that Atlantis was located near Gades, an ancient name associated with Cadiz. In the mid-2000s, a group of German researchers using satellite images claimed to have found traces of Atlantis nearby. The formation was in a large natural park with marshy terrain and supposedly resembled the ring structure of land and water described by Plato. Yes, the rings turned out to be part of the mainland, not on an island, but the researchers called that a minor inconsistency, just like Plato states, which they also treated as symbolic. They claimed the city there was destroyed by a tsunami about 100-200 years before Plato was born. At the time, the theory sounded promising. The problem is, the soil there is swampy, and excavations are extremely difficult. Some years later, the team managed soil analysis through probing.
It appeared there were indeed some structures at depth. They somehow extracted a sample, dated it, and it turned out to be about 2,000 years old, meaning the structures were built about 400 years after Plato died. This Spanish region also connects to another hypothesis, that the legendary lost city of Tartessos was once located there. Unlike Atlantis, which serious scholars generally don't rush to search for, Tartessos is a real target for many archaeologists. There are many references to it by authors who lived during Plato's time and earlier. Tartessos was a developed trading center. Its inhabitants had their own language, unlike others in the region. The city disappeared a couple of centuries before Plato's birth and might have served as a prototype for Atlantis. Who knows? So we figured out that the famous lost civilization most likely was born in the imagination of an ancient Greek. But it's still unclear, where did Plato get the ring-shaped city idea? What did the dates in his story mean, since they don't match what historical science knows? And why did he include so many numbers? There is a hypothesis that it's tied to symbolism, Plato's love of mathematics, and that the numbers encode some kind of message, but no one has managed to decode it. The abundance of conspiracy theories around Atlantis is easy to explain. The emptiness of the unknown will always be filled by something. And since we've talked about patterns so much today, here's an interesting detail. Conspiracy theories around Atlantis, like many other conspiracy theories, work by the same mechanism. First, the author invents a theory. Crazy or not, it doesn't matter. What matters is that the author likes it very much, or it serves the author's goals. Then the author searches for evidence, and usually finds a few true facts. Everything that contradicts the theory, usually far more numerous, gets ignored. And that's how a conspiracy theory appears. Interestingly, another phenomenon works in exactly the same way: propaganda. So if Plato wrote Atlantis as a moral story, he definitely